completed. During that time, in bustling academies of learning, there was constant studying, interpreting, and reinterpreting of the Bible. Scholars did not always agree. The two rival schools of the first century, which included the disciples of Hillel and the disciples of Shammai, differed on hundreds of points of Jewish law, even on such minor matters as whether the Hanukkah lights should be kindled from left to right or right to left. So far apart were the schools in their thinking and observance that the Talmud expresses the fear that there was danger that the one Torah might end up as two. During the first 5 centuries of the Common Era, scholars in the academies of learning in Babylonia and Palestine were busily engaged in explaining and interpreting the words of the Bible. The first group to do this was the Tanaim. They were the scholars of the 1st and 2nd century who continued the debates begun by Hillel and Shammai. These scholars included Rabbi Akiba and Rabbi Ishmael. Finally, by about 220 CE, the debates and decisions were summarized and edited by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. This body of literature is called the Mishnah, which once edited was considered final. It became the authoritative source of halakha, or Jewish law, second only to the Bible itself. The period that followed the Tanaitic period, extending from approximately 220 to 470 CE, was called the Amoraic period. During this time, scholars known as Amoraim studied the text of the Mishnah and added their comments and interpretations. The discussions and laws of the Babylonian Amoraim, together with the Mishnah itself, were finally collected in what is known as the Babylonian Talmud. The views and opinions of the Palestinian Amoraim, together with the Mishnah itself, were collected in what is known as the Jerusalem or Palestinian Talmud. Because the Babylonian Talmud was finalized at a later date than the Jerusalem Talmud, its decisions are generally the more accepted ones. The Gaonic period followed this Talmudic period. Gaonim were distinguished scholars in the great academies of Babylonia. Their interpretations and opinions became paramount for centuries to follow. Despite the closing of the Talmud by the Amoraim, the Gaonim and later scholars introduced takanot, or rulings, on matters not specifically treated in the Talmud itself. In the 6th century and later, as groups of Jews settled further away from the centers of Jewish learning in Babylonia and Palestine, old customs changed and new ones came into being. Local customs varied, and they had the power of law. Even the Gaonim, who were very influential with the Jews of the diaspora between the 7th and 11th centuries, refused to tamper with local customs. They went so far as to support the retention of local practices of which they personally did not approve. Throughout the Middle Ages, scholars such as Rashi in France wrote commentaries on the Bible and Talmud. Their writings were used as a basis for interpreting the law in order to arrive at practical decisions. Questions of law were addressed to scholars on issues where the Talmud did not offer direct or complete guidance. The responses to these questions were often different, depending on the locality from which they were issued. But they became the basis for new codifications of the halakha. By the 12th century, many authorities were extremely worried about the effect of the diversity of opinion and interpretation of Jewish law. The effort to create uniformity began. In France in the 12th century, Rabbeinu Jacob Tam, the grandson of Rashi, condemned the proliferation of individual customs. He considered the differences in local custom detrimental to Jewish unity. By the 15th century, with the appearance of the German rabbi Jacob Levi Molin, known as the Maharil, some of the diversity was restrained. The Maharil wrote a book that established standards for synagogue practices and community conduct. The effort undertaken by the Maharil continued and reached its climax with the appearance a century later of the Shulchan Aruch. To this day, it is the authoritative code of Jewish law. At first, the Shulchan Aruch was not accepted by all of Jewry because it did not represent the attitudes of German and Polish Jews. They constituted a major portion of the world Jewish population. But the problem was remedied when Moses Iselis of Krakow wrote his famous notes to the Shulchan Aruch, which took German and Polish opinions and practices into account. Despite the primacy of the Shulchan Aruch, other influences were felt by Jews. Jews were people of the world. Jewish communities existed in Asia, Africa, and Europe, each with its own character and dress, each with its local foods and eating habits, each with its own language. The laws, customs, and ceremonies observed by each local Jewish community prevailed even when they did not coincide precisely with the Shulchan Aruch. With the advent of the modern age and the growth of conservative and reform movements in the United States and elsewhere, new attitudes and customs began to emerge. These liberal movements introduced the Bar Mitzvah, Bat Mitzvah, and confirmation ceremonies. They took issue with many observances, particularly those connected with the nature of work, as reflected in Sabbath observance. Their committees on Jewish law often issued opinions and directives which did not conform to the accepted Orthodox interpretation. The reasons for these new practices and attitudes are treated on this tape as well. The Jewish Book of Why covers all aspects of Jewish life, including marriage, death, and mourning, dietary laws, synagogue ritual, with much concentration on the holidays in the Jewish calendar. Because it is virtually impossible to fully understand the holidays without some knowledge of the Jewish calendar, some basic information is presented at the outset. The Jewish calendar was put in its present form over 1600 years ago. Until 359 CE, the Sanhedrin functioned in Jerusalem as the supreme judicial body in Jewish life. Through a special calendar council, the Sanhedrin decided when a leap year would occur and whether the months of Chishvan and Kislev should have 29 or 30 days. This process of adding to the calendar extra days or months was necessary in order to harmonize the Jewish calendar with the civil calendar. There is an 11-day discrepancy between the two, because the Jewish calendar is based on the movement of the moon, and the civil calendar on the movement of the sun. The 11-day difference was reconciled by adding an extra month every 2 or 3 years, in fact 7 times in 19 years, to the Jewish calendar. In addition, each year a day was added or subtracted from the months of Cheshvan and Kislev. A fixed calendar was not established until the middle of the 4th century CE. Before that time, there was a degree of uncertainty regarding the calendar because the arrival of each month had to be attested to by 2 witnesses. They would appear before the Sanhedrin and testify that they personally had seen the crescent of the new moon. If accepted as truth by the Sanhedrin, this information was transmitted by torch signals from community to community throughout Palestine. The testimony of witnesses was no longer required when Hillel II decided to publish the calendar for distribution to all communities. By this action, the official days of each of the Jewish holidays was fixed. A final note. According to the civil calendar, a new day begins at midnight and extends for 24 hours. In the Jewish calendar, the day begins and ends at sunset. Therefore, according to the Jewish calendar, a person who was born at 9 p.m. on Thursday night, January the 1st, 1981, is considered to have been born on Friday, January the 2nd. His Jewish birthday is Friday, 26 Tevet, 5741, which corresponds to January the 2nd, 1981. The early years. Judaism is more than a religion. It is a way of life. Over the centuries, it has created standards of practice, most of which have been codified in the Shulchan Aruch, or Code of Jewish Law. These laws spell out what the conduct of the Jew should be from the moment he opens his eyes in the morning until the moment his head touches the pillow at night. Many of the questions posed by the modern Jew about the early years of the life cycle relate to rites of circumcision, the Brit, and the redemption of the first son, known as Pidyon Haben. The modern Jew is also deeply concerned about the naming of children. When, where, and how is the child to be named? Are there any restrictions imposed upon the name selection? These questions, as well as those relating to the bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah, and confirmation ceremonies, will be treated now. Why is the religion of the mother the primary factor in determining the religion of the child? Jewish law considers a child Jewish if the mother is Jewish. A child is considered non-Jewish if the mother is non-Jewish, regardless of the father's religion. The rule was established because one can be sure who gave birth to the child, whereas the paternity is sometimes questionable. In March 1983, the Reform Rabbinate recognized the validity of patrilineal descent, by which the child of a non-Jewish mother and a Jewish father is to be considered Jewish if that child is reared as a Jew and is identified formally and publicly with the Jewish faith. Why is the child of a Jewish woman who converts to another religion still considered Jewish? A child born of a Jewish mother is considered Jewish regardless of the future actions of the mother or father. The child's Jewishness is considered his or her natural right, one that cannot be denied by the action of either parent. Why is a Jewish male child circumcised? Biblical law requires that every son of a Jewish woman be circumcised on the 8th day after his birth. The word for circumcision in Hebrew is brit, which means covenant. This refers to a pledge God made to Abraham, in which he promised to bless Abraham and make him prosper if Abraham in turn would be loyal to God. This covenant was entered into and sealed by the act of circumcision, called in Hebrew ot brit, sign of the covenant. Genesis records the agreement in these words: "And ye shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin, and that will serve as a sign of the covenant between me and you." This section in Genesis ends with these words: "And the uncircumcised male shall be cut off from his people. He hath broken my commandment." Why is the circumcision performed by a mohel? The person who cuts away the foreskin is called a mohel in Hebrew. Although any qualified Jew who is proficient at the surgical procedure and is able to recite the appropriate blessings may perform the circumcision, the mohel is a specialist who is able to execute the procedure as efficiently as any surgeon. If the father is able to perform the circumcision, it is his duty to do so. He is not permitted to delegate the function to anyone else. Why are women traditionally not permitted to perform a circumcision? Originally, it was the father's obligation to circumcise his child. The first instance was Abraham, who circumcised Isaac when he was 8 days old. Later, the function was assumed by a professional mohel, who was in effect a surrogate of the father. Hence, he had to be a male. In the case of Zipporah, wife of Moses, who undertook to circumcise her son with a polished stone, the Talmud claims that she did not complete the circumcision, that Moses did. This detail, not mentioned in the Bible, is the rabbinic way of declaring that the obligation to circumcise belongs to the father and should not be performed